Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. On the first day of this month, a military strike on a diplomatic compound in the Syrian capital Damascus killed 7 members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, including one of its most senior generals. Israel is suspected to have carried out that attack. A week ago, reports were beginning to emerge that Iran's vowed response was imminent. And 48 hours later, Iran launched more than 300 drones and ballistic missiles against Israel, the vast majority of which were either destroyed by Israel's Iron Dome air defense system or intercepted by jets from the US and other Israeli allies. For some people, these two events represent a diplomatic success in the form of a high-stakes game being expertly played by opponents whose back-channel communications are ensuring hostilities don't spill over into a full-scale war. But for others, they represent a game changer, and these people see a dangerous escalation of a deep-seated rivalry that was previously conducted through proxies rather than direct conflict. The fallout continues to raise a whole range of serious questions. In this edition of the show, we'll try to answer as many of them as possible with perspectives from Israel, Iran, and the US. And we begin with Israel's Deputy Consul General in New York City, Tzak Saad. Tzak, thank you for making some time for us. I have to start by asking you, how much warning did you get from Iran, and what sort of detail in terms of warnings?
So it's not about warnings. It's about a threat that is ongoing from Iran. Iran is playing a destabilizing role in the Middle East for the Iranian regime, actually, for decades now. And this is part of its what they have been doing in the last years. And it's not that it was a warning or anything. We were ready because we were expecting something coming from Iran. Unfortunately, we were ready together with our allies in the region and the United States, of course.
I'll touch on the background a little bit more in a moment. The casualty rate was very low. A young girl, sadly, was injured. But I wonder, had Israel's allies not been involved, how much more serious could the situation have been?
Well, it just proves that it's not a matter of casualties or damage, actual damage. We have been preparing with defensive and defense system for years because we know what kind of threat the Iranian regime poses. By the way, not just to Israel but to the region as a whole. We've seen their capabilities in 2019. We know exactly what they're capable of, and unfortunately, these are not capabilities that we can take easily. This is very, very difficult. I don't think it's a matter of casualties. Unfortunately, we had casualties and a very small damage in one of the areas in Israel. But 99% of the missiles, drones, ballistic missiles were intercepted, thanks to the Israeli capabilities, defensive capabilities, and all the players in the region.
I heard this described as a sort of wave, ballistic wave of missiles and drones that came in. I wonder what Israel learned about Iran's military capabilities from this particular attack.
The numbers are known. The numbers of missiles are known. Their capabilities are not, how we define that. I keep saying threat and threat. How do you define a threat? You have the intention that unfortunately they are very vocal and outspoken about it, what they want to do and wipe Israel off the map. And by the way, they're not threatening only Israel in the region. And the second thing is capabilities. We see their capabilities and we have experienced it. We know, it's well known, they have around 3,000 ballistic missiles, and that's just the ballistic missiles. What about dozens of thousands of UAVs that they're exporting to the region and contributing to the destabilization, not only of the Middle East, but also other regions of the world?
Now, these UAVs, the drones as they've been described, obviously were a big part of this attack. What do you think Iran learned about Israel's military capabilities from doing the attack this way?
I think it's not just about military capabilities. Our capabilities are also known, and I think we've demonstrated them beautifully on Saturday. But what should be the lesson for the Iranian regime from Saturday is the level of regional understandings and the level of the alliance between different players in the region, that they share a common understanding of the threat coming from Tehran. And this is a very, very strong message, and this is the lesson.
Now, one thing, Zach, the latest escalation was sparked by the attack on an Iranian diplomatic location in Damascus, and whoever planned that attack from the Israeli side, it's believed to be obviously from Israel, must have known that the allies of Israel would have to unite to defend Israel. So, you know, in a way, it's actually united the allies. It's brought them together with Israel at a time when it seemed they were clearly pulling away to a large degree. And of course, it gives Prime Minister Netanyahu a chance to kind of come out a hero in this. So the skeptical view is that perhaps this was Israel's way of pulling back its allies after seeing them pulling away in recent months.
Look, I don't know what happened in Damascus, but I can tell you one thing. From different sources, it is quite clear that it was not an Iranian consulate that was targeted on that day. This is a narrative that the Iranians are trying to promote as kind of a pretext for their attack on Saturday. I don't think Israel should bring allies from the region together, and Saudis, Jordanians, they can speak for themselves. They don't need me to say that. But the threat is clear for them. And unfortunately, Iran demonstrated it in 2019 and later on. Just the number of the reports of their attempts to, I would say, to try and take some very destructive actions in the region, even before October 7th, and not even against Israel, are multiple. There are a lot of reports about what they're trying to do.
The enmity between Israel and Iran is documented, well documented, and there has been prodding and poking from both sides in terms of actions against each other. There are those who believe now that this is an opportunity that perhaps Prime Minister Netanyahu and his allies in the government are taking to drag this into a bigger conflict and put Israel in a stronger position by pulling the allies together for a wider escalated conflict.
So again, I don't know specifically about this incident in Damascus that you were mentioning next to the consulate. But I can tell you that Israel will hit and hits its enemies in Lebanon and in Syria, whether they are Lebanese, Syrian, or from other nationalities, because they have opened several fronts against Israel after October 7th. By the way, it was October 7th is an unprovoked war against Israel. And they have opened these fronts, and they will have to pay the price because we have to defend our citizens. Let's not forget that we have dozens of thousands of citizens that are currently displaced. This situation cannot go longer.
Zach, I won't go into the narrative of October the 7th again, because obviously that's been well discussed and there are views on both sides. But I do wonder, you know, the US has called on Israel to not further escalate this situation. And yet, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to be going against that, just as he's pulling the US in a little bit on his side. It sounds really pretty much like Israel is ignoring its closest ally.
There's no daylight between Israel and the United States about the goals of the war, period. The goals are dismantling Hamas and bringing back the hostages. There's no differences about it. That's clear. And talking about the war itself, if you just count the numbers of Israeli soldiers currently in the Gaza Strip, you will see what is the level of the warfare at this moment. There are continuous discussions between Israel and the United States, very intensive, all the time. The number of the visits of the Secretary of State Blinken to Jerusalem are countless. He's been to Israel since October 7th, maybe 6 or 7 times now. So the cooperation, the discussion, the consultations is very, very close, and there's no daylight in this issue.
There is some difference in those visits. You know, initially, obviously, a lot of support. Then there's the preaching of caution from the U.S. to Israel not to take this further. There is a worry, it seems, that the U.S. may be dragged into a war with Iran if Israel continues this path.
Which path? I'm not sure I understand which path. Again, the goal in Gaza is to dismantle Hamas and to release the hostages.
That's fine. I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to the situation with Iran in particular. Has the Israeli war cabinet, that has been quite vociferous in its approach following the Iranian attack, is it going to take action now directly against Iran?
So I think that you should not leave questions unanswered in the Middle East. And to what happened on Saturday, there will be an answer. It can be a long answer. It can be a short answer. It can be today. It can be tomorrow. It can be a kinetic answer. It can be a diplomatic answer, or both. But there will be an answer, and it will be a strong one, for sure.
It sounds like that it's going to be pretty much the status quo then. Israel wants to kind of take Iran out of the picture, and Iran wants to take Israel out of the picture. So in terms of something happening, it looks like you're back to square one.
No, it's definitely not keeping the status quo, because Saturday night attack on Israel was definitely not the status quo. It was an extreme escalation of the situation, an unprecedented attack on Israel from a sovereign country against another sovereign country. This is definitely not the status quo.
So then how do you respond to the analysts who say this was kind of a clever maneuver by Iran that allowed them to give a lot of warning, to indicate that they would react to what happened in Damascus, but not take it to a point where Israel is forced into a much more aggressive retaliatory action?
I don't see how 120 ballistic missiles and hundreds of drones that are shot at a sovereign country from another sovereign country can be called a clever maneuver.
Well, in the sense that, Zach, that giving warnings they were coming, giving Israel and its allies the opportunity to take some action against that attack, to symbolically attack Israel on its soil, and yet not create the level of damage or the kind of action and reaction that would lead to a much greater reaction from Israel.
So again, I cannot see how this kind of attack, unprecedented attack, can be named symbolic or proportionate. And I just ask myself, if Israel is expected to react proportionally, so should we fire at Iran 120 ballistic missiles and drones and give them a notice in advance? Would that be a proportionate response? Would that escalate, or would not escalate the situation?
Well, the point being is that this is a very different kind of attack. But one thing I want to ask you is the risk of the situation escalating into a wider conflict brings in the risk of Hezbollah getting engaged more, getting much more of a reaction from those who are against Israel in the region. What resources does have Israel to stretch itself into a conflict wider, since it's so already involved in Gaza?
Definitely, we see that Iran is orchestrating what we call the axis of evil against Israel, which starts from Hamas. They have been funding, training, sending materials to them since forever. Hezbollah in Lebanon, in Syria, Shia militias in Iraq, and also the Houthis in Yemen. So this is definitely a challenge, but our allies in the United States and in the region understand the destabilizing role that Iran is doing for their own safety, for their own security. And this is indeed a challenge, but there is an opportunity here for a change.
Was there any surprise in Israel, from what you know, Tzak, to the equipment and the missiles and the armaments that Iran has? It seemed to be, in some people's opinion, a lot more sophisticated than people might have originally estimated.
Well, we never underestimate the capabilities of our enemies, and definitely the Iranian regime's attack on Israel on Saturday was indeed sophisticated, strong, and unprecedented. Even if we know what they have, it doesn't necessarily mean that we know what their intentions are of using it and in what extent. But we definitely know, but we don't know what we don't know.
What happens next, Zach?
I hope that we can, if I'm talking about the Gaza front,
the broader picture.
The broader picture is ending the war in Gaza by releasing the hostages and the surrender of Hamas, laying down its weapons, having some kind of an arrangement in the north that would bring our citizens back to their homes. Again, I'm talking about dozens of thousands of Israelis that are currently displaced. I don't know any other country in the world that would accept that.
Well, you have even more Palestinians displaced right now.
Where?
In Gaza.
In Gaza, definitely. And that's a tragic situation. That's a very tragic situation. But we shouldn't forget who put them in this situation. Again, October 7th was an unprovoked war against Israel. And prior to October 7th, maybe it's important to mention it, and it's important to emphasize the fact that Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip totally in 2005. And since then, there's no Israeli presence, not civilian, not military, in Gaza. And that's a tragedy what's happening now in Gaza, not just for the Palestinians, but also for the Israelis. And we would like to see this war over, and we would like to see both people thrive and prosper. The problem is that they are being controlled and oppressed by a designated terrorist organization, and let me also say genocidal, and they are putting their own people in that situation.
So, Tzak, I won't go over that narrative because, I mean, October the 7th was a terrible black spot in history. There's no doubt about that. But that's a narrative we can go down and discuss for ages. What happens next as far as Israel and Iran?
Well, we will have to see how things evolve. Again, the goal is not to escalate the situation. As I mentioned, there will be an answer. There must be an answer for what we saw, because this is unprecedented. Again, not just in the fact that it was a sovereign country attacking another sovereign country, and in unprecedented in the extent of the attack. So there will be an answer, and as I said, it can be also a mixture of kinetic and a very strong diplomatic response.
What impact has this attack had on Prime Minister Netanyahu's status, position among the average Israeli person?
Well, there is it's not the Prime Minister's war, or it's the citizens and the population of Israel, both Jews, Muslim, Christians, security. They would like to live in peace, and they would like to have security, and it's their war. It's not about the prime minister popularity or situation. We're now dealing with a very complicated situation where we, as you mentioned, have to combat in different fronts orchestrated by Iran. And it's definitely a challenge, but we have a unity government and they run the situation, and it's not a war of the prime minister.
Well, Taksar, I'm sure we'll have a chance to speak again. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you so much.
That was the perspective of Taksar, Israel's Deputy Consul General in New York. In the space of a few days, the US President Joe Biden went from calling Israel's handling of events in Gaza a mistake to declaring US support for Israel against Iran as ironclad. Now the US has called for Israeli restraint, but those calls seem to be falling on deaf ears following statements from the Israeli War Cabinet. So has Iran helped repair a relationship with the US that was looking increasingly uncomfortable over Gaza? I'm joined now by the Principal Deputy Spokesperson for the US State Department, Vedant Patel. Vedant, thanks for joining us on the show. First question really is, which is the most provocative of the two, Israel's attack on Iran in Damascus or Iran's response with its attack on Israel?
Well, the important thing to remember is that since October 7th, we have been incredibly clear to all regional parties that it is really important that there not be escalation. The United States is certainly not looking for any kind of all-out conflict in the region. But let me just be unequivocally clear. We, in the strongest terms, condemn Iran's attack on Israel over the course of this past weekend, and our commitment to Israel's security and its self-defense is ironclad.
The issue is this, that though Iran seemed to conduct a very interesting attack with warnings given ahead of time. The way it was structured was almost to cause a noise without really creating something that seemed like a major escalation.
I'm not sure I would categorize it as interesting. We're talking about more than 300 ballistic missiles, drones, all fired at Israel. The way that I described it is incredibly deadly, and we think it's provocative and reckless and irresponsible. And that's why you saw the United States step up its commitment to defend our partners in Israel, as our commitment to their security and their self-defense is unwavering.
I guess by interesting, I meant the way it was conducted to apparently create enough of an international kind of noise without major damage on the ground. Now, of course, there was a defense system in place, but it seems there's some sort of cat and mouse game being played here, where it seems, according to some analysts, Israel is trying to draw the US closer to it again in order to be able to bridge that gap that seemed to appear when President Biden called for more restraint recently.
Well, first, I would reject the premise of any kind of gap. Israel is one of our closest partners, including especially as it relates to the Middle East region. And as we do with any country, sometimes we have disagreements. And when it comes to certain actions and things that have happened since these horrific October 7th terrorist attacks, we have had frank and candid discussions with our partners in Israel. But our commitment to their self-defense and our commitment to their security is unwavering.
Well, talking to Israeli representatives from the government, they say there will be a response to this. How does that align or misalign with the U.S. request for restraint?
Well, I'm glad you're talking to officials from the Israeli government, because that is something that that's for them to speak to. Certainly, we wouldn't speak to any kind of Israeli operation. And as we've said before, it's not something that the United States would participate in. But our commitment to their self-defense is ironclad, and we will not hesitate to defend them in the face of provocative and reckless behavior like we saw from Iran this past weekend.
I guess the question is, would you expect Israel to heed the U.S. call for restraint?
The important thing is that this is something our Israeli partners can speak to.
To what extent do U.S. expressions of solidarity for Israel over this recent attack make it harder to criticize Israel over what's happening in Gaza?
These are while these issues are linked, certainly because of what is ongoing in the region, our focus and our continued focus on doing everything we can to ensure that humanitarian aid gets into Gaza, doing everything we can to ensure that all these hostages can be released and return home. Our focus on that is enduring, and we'll continue to work on those efforts in close coordination with our partners in Israel and other partners in the region as well.
This week we saw what seemed to be quite an awkward briefing by the White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, who described the situation as not pre-warned. He said the US was not pre-warned and described the description of this warning as malarkey, quoting President Biden, even though a number of other nations seem to have been warned that Iran was going to take this attack. And I wonder how much this has become a game of words in trying to figure out what really happened.
The important thing, I think we're focusing on details here that are irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that Iran undertook a really reckless and dangerous and provocative attack on Israel over the course of this past weekend. And Secretary Blinken and others in the United States government spent the weekend working closely with partners and allies in the region. The secretary himself spoke to foreign ministers in Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt and Jordan on the need to de-escalate and on the need to hold the Iranian regime appropriately accountable for these kinds of escalatory behaviors.
I guess wrapping up, I should bring up an issue that a few people have, that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, asked the question, why is it okay to use US jets to defend Israel from attack, but not Ukraine, when neither is a NATO country? What's your answer to that?
Well, these are two totally different circumstances that are really not comparable. But our commitment to Ukraine is also unwavering. And since the Russian infringement on Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty, we have at quite a high rate provided security assistance, including defensive assets, to our partners in Ukraine so that they can defend themselves, and will continue to do so.
Vedant Patel, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much.
The thoughts there of the principal deputy spokesperson for the US State Department, Vedant Patel. So where do the events of the past week leave Iran? Diminished or empowered? For our final perspective on the conflict, we turn to an Iranian-American analyst known for his expertise in Iranian security and politics. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at the foreign policy research body, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Behnam, thank you for making the time for this conversation.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me.
Israel, the US, and Iran have all talked about how serious this attack is, and yet there still seems to be a degree of skepticism, which John Kirby at the White House press briefing addressed, about how much real intent there was to create widespread damage and casualties and so on. To what degree was this a face-saving episode for all sides to kind of support their own narratives?
Well, certainly the weapons the Islamic Republic of Iran used were not designed to be merely face-saving, although the Islamic Republic is a master of using military means to accomplish political ends. So therefore, there certainly was a public relations or a public diplomacy facing side to what the Islamic Republic did. But make no mistake, when you're firing high and fast flying ballistic missiles with warheads 5 to 10 times the size of the weight of the drones that they also fired, which are lower and slower flying, those are meant to kill. I actually remember this debate sort of in January 2020 when the Iranians struck back at the two U.S. bases in Iraq after the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes in Iraq. And we had the same kind of debate. So ballistic missiles are not merely tools of signaling. They're weapons of war that sometimes can have a signaling component.
Are you surprised then at the relative lack of damage?
I'm actually, the more distance I get from the attack over the weekend, the more I see it as a win for deterrence by denial, meaning the architecture that Israel had built since the last time it faced a state-to-state state threat that was also in the missile domain, which was 1991, the first Persian Gulf War with Saddam Hussein shooting over extended range Scuds. And I think at that time, Israel only had the PAC-2, the Patriot 2, if I'm not mistaken. To date, in the years since that strike, Israel is home to the most well-connected, most well-layered air and missile defense architecture in the Middle East and maybe among the world. That was then backstopped, of course, by a coalition of forces that included the U.S., the U.K., France, and Jordan. And to that degree, the Islamic Republic, which in its history had only fired ballistic missiles from its own territory, a handful of times during peace, had never struck a defended target, which is very much akin to someone saying, I don't like black pepper on my risotto, but then pouring a gallon of Tabasco. One is not prepared for the other.
What do you make then of the whole debate of warnings being given so far in advance by the Iranians?
Some of the reporting, particularly the reporting that we've seen in the past 48 hours, talking about a Turkish channel, the Iranians allegedly warning the Turks, the Americans also vis-a-vis the Swiss. Listen, the Iranians benefited immensely. I would say benefited much more so from the 12 days between the killing of Brigadier General Zahedi in Damascus to the firing of their drones and missiles on April 13th or April 14th, because of the panic and the terror that they were able to instill, not just in Western media, but also on the ground in Israel itself. Lest we forget, the Islamic Republic of Iran is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, and they're able actually to inject this terrorism in a boom and bust cycle at a time of their choosing. So I think that was precisely why they wanted to have this dribs and drabs of information come out, because they could weaponize it, and this would redound to its status dividend that their revisionist revolutionary Iran is able to make everyone fear these things, and the security dividend, which is to say that one ought to fear these things because of the track record of these weapons. But after the strike, I think there is certainly a different track record, and ironically, the regime may have painted more of a target on its back, given the lack of military effectiveness we all witnessed.
So you don't buy into this idea that this was Iran's way of creating some kind of symbolic response that would allow it to save face with its allies and its people, and yet show that there was a response to what Israel had done on its own facilities in Syria?
I don't deny the political logic that went into the strike, indeed the face-saving logic that the regime felt it had to exercise. Lest we forget, the regime had absorbed not just this attack, but several rounds of cyber attacks, sabotage against Iranian nuclear and military facilities inside Iran, as well as lots of erosions of its position, as well as the position of some of its proxies in Syria for several years now. And in fact, Israel became increasingly public about those operations in Syria that it called the war between the wars, or the campaign between the wars. So there was a political component to it. I simply think that this was the drop that overflowed the bucket. And that's why this nature of the strike, which is the first overt land-to-land public ballistic missile operation from Iranian territory against Israel, when for 45 years the regime had been fighting in the shadows, is so significant. It's the merging of all those rationales.
Now, of course, the attack did provide the Israeli leadership with some degree of support domestically and internationally at a time, of course, when support has been waning. To what extent do you think this actually had a unifying effect of the people, with the people of Iran, with its leadership?
Well, this is actually very interesting because many have talked about the regime needing to save face due to some kind of domestic pressure. The funny thing is, since 2009, Iranians have been protesting, chanting, "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran." Since 2018, they've been protesting and chanting, "Forget Syria, think about us." Since 2019 and into the present, they've been chanting, "Where is the oil money? It's been spent in Palestine." And even much more recently, they've been escalating their rhetoric, targeting the Palestinian issue, the more the regime has doubled down on the Palestinian issue. So you couldn't have a bigger divergence in the Middle East between the state in Iran and the society in Iran. So if the regime was engaging in domestic signaling, it was more so to save face with regime elites who were fellow hardliners, or to signal resolve to the Iranian population, which the regime had been repressing, as we now know, after those different rounds of protests, particularly after the Mahsa Amini protests.
So with recent years, Hamas and Hezbollah firing rockets at Israel as Iran's proxies, according to most analysts. Is this going to change as a result of this, and we see Iran more directly targeting Israel itself?
Well, in the aftermath of the strike, the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Hossein Salami, talked about a change in doctrine, meaning that if Iran was threatened or attacked, or if its external interests were threatened or attacked, the regime would reserve the right to respond from within Iranian territory. And that's why now the potential Israeli response is going to be very interesting to see. Not just because before the strike, Israelis had said, if you strike Israeli territory, we will strike Iranian territory. I even think they tweeted something to that effect, tagging the supreme leader of Iran in this kind of tit-for-tat commentary. But also because if the Israelis strike something outside of Iran, would the regime risk again the attribution that comes from launching from your own territory and the signature that comes with it? And again, cobbling together that coalition against it when it comes from such a public brazen act from your own territory. It's an open question.
So what response could you see from Israel now that would be appropriate according to what Israel demands, and yet not escalating things and spiraling it to an uncontrollable level?
Well, I think at this point in time, we are within the confines of an escalation spiral. It would be dishonest to say otherwise, not just because of the Iranian response, not just because of the killing of Brigadier General Zahedi. We have to see what has been going on here pre-October 7, post-October 7. And one reality is I don't see a world in which a post-October 7 Israel is going to be content with an adversary that is the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, home to the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, now pursuing a nuclear weapons program where, by the way, no one has been talking about Iran's growing atomic infrastructure since the terrorism focus was put on the region since October 7. I don't see them sitting back and just absorbing that. Now, a dampener to this, of course, is the drama between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu that we've seen erupt again and again during the past 6 months of the conflict in Gaza, as well as as we get closer and closer towards the U.S. presidential cycle, that too may factor in. But again, I do think when the Israelis telegraph that if you strike Israeli territory, we'll strike Iranian territory, they mean it. And to that end, we could see mixed responses. One might see a cyber attack that is covert and then something overt outside of Iranian territory first to test that doctrine that Hossein Salami had talked about. Conversely, more recent outlets like CNN are reporting that there might be a narrow, tailored, limited strike, perhaps to contrast the inaccuracy of Iran strikes with the hyper-precision of Israel strikes. It still really is anyone's guess.
How do you regard the thought that this was Israel's way of poking Iran enough to elicit a response that would bring the US closer to, again, after recent warnings of its situation in Gaza, and the US the leadership seeming to pull away from Israel?
There are some actually who, even before the Israeli strike that killed Brigadier General Zahedi in Damascus, there are some who even saw this campaign between the wars, or for instance, a few years back, the targeted killing of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh Mahabadi, Iran's chief nuclear scientist in Iran, by Israel, or some of the drone attacks against Iranian drone facilities in Iran. Saw all of this not as a way to manage the Iran threat by the Israelis. Some folks saw this as a way to provoke Iran into a conventional response that would then allow Israel to play on the terrain that it wants. I don't necessarily see it that way, because the Israelis take out these targets based on my assessment as targets of opportunity. If the intelligence is there and they have the capability, they will act on it. That's largely been the modus operandi of the IAF and IDF and everything else. But it's interesting to note that before the Iranians responded on April 13, April 14, you've had people like Iran's former ambassador to Iraq flood the airwaves in Iran, talk about that this is a trap, that if we respond overtly and kinetically, we'll be playing on the battlefield that the Israelis are masters of, which is, again, conventional military force. And it's not ironic that every Iranian ambassador to Iraq since the fall of Saddam has been a Quds Force official. So naturally, this individual's prescription for how to respond was to target an Israeli embassy in Europe. That's what he put forward.
Do you believe that Iran really would want to engage in a wider regional escalation?
I believe the Islamic Republic is comfortable with wider regional escalation, but not comfortable with a regional war that lands on its doorstep. The 1980-1988 Iran-Iraq war really is the never again moment. It's the issue that all of Iran's political and security elite cut their teeth in, and their national security doctrine flows from. In fact, it was that conflict that saw the first use of Iranian drones, saw Iran procuring ballistic missiles and ultimately producing ballistic missiles. There's a straight line from that conflict to how the regime has been adjudicating the rest of its fights in the Middle East today. Pushing back from that, the last thing I think the regime wants is to be decapitated. So in that end, despite it being an ideological regime, it's rationally proceeded against the U.S., against Israel, against whatnot, such that it would not invite overwhelming kinetic force. So this is a very long-winded way to say the regime is comfortable with tension, the regime is comfortable with confrontation, the regime is comfortable with escalation. The regime is not comfortable if an outright war lands on its own doorstep.
There are those who believe that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has nothing to lose now, that he would perhaps benefit from an escalation into a regional conflict. What's your perspective on that?
I've heard that, and I understand that vis-a-vis the Iran context. The reason I disagree with it is well before April 13, 14, and well before April 1, which was the strike in Damascus, many had said this about Israel's engagement vis-a-vis Lebanon. But the Israelis, despite having almost 2 decades of the lack of the international community enforcing Resolution 1701 in Lebanon to get Hezbollah to go north of the Litani River, to get that terrorist group to disarm, to get all of these things, you've had the Lebanese armed forces fail in doing it. You've had the Europeans fail in moderating and mediating that. You've had the Lebanese government itself fail at that. You've had the UN Security Council fail at that. So every time Hezbollah after October 8th began to fire into Israel, the Israelis would respond. And you heard this multiple times as the Israelis responded, that this is Bibi or somebody expanding the war for political expediency. Now, I don't deny that there may be a correlation between those two things, but this festering problem on Israel's northern doorstep means that an expansion of the conflict in a different direction is a matter of, I think, respectfully, when and not if, particularly if that when and not if situation is in a post-October 7 Middle East and in a post-October 7 mentality for the Israeli cabinet, which, by the way, is united despite their politics and gripes with Bibi. I'm not a scholar of Israeli domestic politics, but just looking from what I can infer from this far away, they seem actually more united in contesting those threats than ever before.
Yet, what capacity could Israel have to take on conflict on broader fronts, to expand its military actions, considering how much it's eating up its resources in Gaza?
Indeed, for what one might call the lowest of the low-hanging fruit in this constellation of partners and proxies that Tehran calls the acts of resistance, the capabilities of Hamas pale in comparison to the capabilities of Hezbollah, which has, upwards of 150 to 175,000 mortars, rockets, and perhaps most importantly, interspersed in their precision-guided munitions, which, despite the success of Israel's air and missile defenses over the weekend, could still be used to swarm or penetrate Iron Dome, depending on how they fire their volleys. These are risks, in my view, the Israelis yet can't afford to take on. So I think they're cognizant about it, which is why the way deterrence is reestablished every day on the northern border with Lebanon is changing on a daily basis and is based on the predicate for how Hezbollah is engaging in these attacks, whether that's a different weapon, a different target, or a different geography.
It's interesting, how you assess the military capable of Hezbollah and its potential, because a lot of military analysts have looked at this attack by Iran and kind of try to analyze the way it was done in terms of waves, the idea there were warnings sent in advance and so on, but also it seemed to be almost a testing of military capabilities. What do you think each side, Iran and Israel, learned about each other militarily from this latest attack?
Well, I know more about the Iranian military than the Israeli military, but one thing, at least for Israeli national security policy, I think that is very apparent after April 13, April 14, is that the salience of the military option against the Islamic Republic of Iran has grown. Meaning, if these are the long-range strike capabilities of the Islamic Republic, and we've now known about the other closer-in threats, such as the terrorism threat, such as Hezbollah, as well as other threats, such as the maritime threat with the Houthis, or classically Iran in the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, that these may be more manageable than ever before. So ironically, that's why I said the regime may have painted a target on its back by firing some of these things and seeing the success of the interconnected air and missile defense and the willingness of this international coalition, despite the 6 months of the war in Gaza and the politics therein, to still be able to backstop Israel and defend against these threats, does raise, the potential idea in the future of more Israeli military action, which is probably the last thing the regime in Tehran wanted. For Iran, based on reports, it raises real performance issues over some of the ballistic missiles. There is no accurate accounting, despite Iran having the biggest ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East, over how many of them are medium range. That's because the point-to-point shortest distance between Iran and Israel is about 1,400 kilometers. Iran has a whole series of systems that can go up to 2,000 kilometers. But unlike the strikes we saw, the dozen or so strikes using ballistic missiles in Syria, in Iraq, and actually earlier this year in Pakistan, the further the distance, the less the performance. And given the fact that almost all of those past strikes were solid propellant systems, and this one was a mix of solid and liquid propellant systems, there are questions as to the management of some of its older legacy liquid propellant systems. And again, their performance over time and their performance over distance. And then the other real military lesson is, you mentioned the waves. By default, they would have to be waves because drones are much lower and slow flying. Not all drones, very few drones that Iran has have jet engines. Almost all of them are piston engines compared to, the motors and engines on Iran's missiles or the turbojet or turbofan engines on Iran's land attack cruise missiles. So the layering that we see is closely akin to the layering we've seen by the Houthis and the layering by the Russians in Ukraine. The difference is in those jurisdictions, the Houthis and the Russians are able to be more effective with these low and slow flying drones because of the lack of an air force. Whereas when the Iraqi airspace was shut and the Jordanian airspace was shut, that's why you had all this imagery coming out from jets targeting these Iranian drones, almost akin to shooting fish in a barrel, which is why barely any Iranian drones even got close to the Israeli border.
I appreciate your perspective on the conventional weapons as you've been discussing them now, but I find myself also a bit surprised we're discussing conventional weapons to this degree when, according to a lot of people, conflicts would be moving into cyberspace, and that perhaps Iran and Israel would be more focused on online attacks and the hacking and so on, as opposed to going so much into a direct military conflict.
There is no doubt that in the many years of the shadow war between Iran and Israel, that the cyber domain and cyber warfare, whether that's hacking or espionage or just kind of industrial damage or anything else, has been a major factor. It certainly has been, and in my view, it likely will be scaled up over time, both following October 7 and both following April 13-14. Beyond that, however, if it factors in very acutely in the Israeli response to April 13, April 14, the Israelis might be able to do more damage, particularly when compared to the Iranian overt conventional threat. But the question in the public domain, because one of the things about cyber is attribution and publicity, which publicity can aid in deterrence, but sometimes deterrence is not going to be socialized that way if only the person getting hit with the capability knows that you have this capability. So the Israelis may be seen as absorbing the Iranian strike, which would be a public relations win for the Islamic Republic, despite likely, if there is a response in the cyber domain, the Israelis being able to overwhelm the Iranians. So it has that paradox.
Yeah, that's interesting. We've seen Russia make heavy use of Iranian drones in their war with Ukraine. I wonder what this latest situation might do in terms of what Iranian supplies to Russia going forward.
Well, the real, even prior to this, the real logistical challenge vis-a-vis the Iranians and the Russians, and that's, ignoring the fact that, Iranians use cargo planes and occasionally other airliners to ferry these drones to Russia. And they also share a border with the world's largest lake, which leads to harder sanctions enforcement over time. Russia to the north of the Caspian, Iran to the south of the Caspian. The Iranians had been helping the Russians per this contract to domestically produce drones. So the Iranians might still be involved in the illicit procurement, but the Russians will be putting together more of these Shahed drones, which the Russians call the Geran. In this world, that takes the strain off of the Iranian production capacity, allowing them to retain these cheaper, lower and slow flying capabilities for themselves or for their proxies. And it also risks moving Iran from arms proliferator, again, for their proxies, to arms salesman. which is really the new face of Iranian weapons production, because slowly but surely Iran has been showing up all around the world, in Russia, in Serbia, not at a booth, but with officials in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Iraq, at arms expos, marketing these newfound capabilities. And the Russian theater and the advertisement for the Shahed drones was one way to get them to market upwards.
The US, of course, threatens greater sanctions each time, and that's been raised again. Would you expect any particular impact if sanctions are increased against Iran? And what could they sanction now? There doesn't seem to have been a lot of effect so far.
Well, to some degree, the fact that the Iranians had to move into missiles and then from missiles into drones is a success of this larger kind of conventional arms sanctions architecture. But the sanctions, in fact, do have to be enforced over time on two fronts. One, macroeconomically, meaning the areas that the regime generates revenue to breathe, to continue to invest. And then B, the actual industries and the actual persons that are part of the supply chain. These people may be diverting Western commercial goods in Malaysia, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in China, in other jurisdictions that don't have necessarily the best track record when it comes to not being a place for end user obfuscation, whether that's missile tech, military tech, or anything else. But ultimately, this is a game of whack-a-mole. Sometimes the whack-a-mole analogy is used to berate sanctions, but if you have the capability to enforce these sanctions over time, whack-a-mole is your success strategy. Because you slow down the rate at which the mole pops up, and you can increase the weight at which you crack down on the mole when it does come up slower. So there is this kind of incentive structure here. Right now, besides what the US is offering, which is probably likely more sanctions, is what the Europeans will be doing. If the Europeans go ahead with not just drone sanctions, but actual missile sanctions, that would be the first non-proliferation sanctions since December 2012 by the European Union, and much more recently since they retained about 200 Iranian missile, military, and nuclear entities that they were supposed to delist in October. So it would be another sign of Europe getting tougher, or getting right, in my view, on the Iran threat, when historically they had been on a different side.
Madam, 7th of October last year marked a massive fracture in alliances and directions that some countries were taking in terms of being allied. I wonder, when you look at how this latest episode between Iran and Israel has occurred, what this has done actually for Iran's status, whether it's diminished it or enhanced it in the region.
In some eyes, it's diminished it, and in some eyes, it's raised it. Here's what I mean by that. In terms of the conventional military threat, it may have diminished it. The problem is you have this asymmetric military threat architecture active throughout the region, continuing to cause chaos. That was very much the world that we had seen pre-April 13, April 14. In other places, the fact that this threat remains but hasn't performed at the same level can begin to repair and build bridges post-October 7. In a sense, while the Israelis and Jordanians may not have been getting along swimmingly like they used to pre-October 7, the fact that Jordan participated, the fact that you had Israeli jets over Jordanian skies, the fact that this was a shared mission could provide a least common denominator to, again, repair ties, build bridges. And then the elephant in the room is really the normalization issue, particularly normalization with Saudi Arabia, which in my view was one major reason why the Iranians kind of supported the larger Hamas attack on October 7 to begin with. Ironically, one of the things pre-October 7 that the Saudis wanted was some kind of defense commitment from the Americans. I think the Saudis just got a front row seat to, if you are a long and stable partner of the U.S. and you have some sort of even informal defense commitments, a la the U.S. and Israel, but there is no formal treaty there as well, here are the capabilities, here are the incentives, and who knows if that might inadvertently lead the Saudis to hedge back towards normalization, whereas after October 7, they had shifted their demands on the Palestinian issue.
Watching the landscape change is certainly going to be an interesting one. As things stand right now between Iran and Israel, is it a case of we just sit and wait to see who responds next or how they respond next?
I think so. It is very much a waiting game. I mean, me as a civilian analyst, yes, it's a sitting, watching, and waiting game. For Washington, it depends a great deal on what their view of the situation is. I think the Biden administration right now as taking a different tack than Israel. The Israelis are looking for deterrence by punishment. The Biden administration is looking for de-escalation and deconfliction. Partly one reason why I think the Iranians took the massive gamble that they did with that overt strike from their territory is that they may have had a good read of the Biden administration, this desire for de-escalation, deconfliction, such that if there was going to be an Israeli response or retaliation, it would begin to draw into question this tight U.S.-Israel security coordination, which we just saw in spades in terms of the defense architecture on April 13, April 14. So again, the Islamic Republic is very good at using military means to accomplish political ends. Political ends they wanted to accomplish after October 7 were literally met on October 8th, which was creating distance between the Arab street and the Arab state, impeding normalization and beginning to put distance between Israel and America. That was all tightened between April 1 and April 14. Now the Islamic Republic is looking to facilitate those cleavages again.
So we sit and wait. Great to have your perspective. Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to Behnam Ben Taleblu of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies for wrapping up our look at the situation following Iran's recent drone and missile attack on Israel. That's all from me and the team. I'm Riz Khan. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.